production, from bottled water to high-end whiskey and champagne to cocktails in a can. Producers are facing pressure to reduce emissions linked to ingredients, manufacturing, and packaging. In 2021, the beverage industry around the world emitted 1.5 billion tons of CO2. That's a 2.5% drop compared to 2018, but still about 3.8% of global emissions. Dairy and alternatives represented the biggest chunk, just under 700 million tons, followed by soft drinks and beer and cider. All sectors have reduced their emissions slightly, but not quite enough to meet the industry's targets for 2030 and 2050. Well, let's bring in Anne Jones, a drinks sustainability consultant based in the UK. Thank you for being with us today. There's no real fixed definition of what makes a product sustainable. So how do you define sustainability in the drinks industry?
I think we have to remember that every drink starts its life in a field. It's a very agricultural product, and although the journey from field to glass can be very complicated, we actually have to look at it holistically. We have to remember, I think, that there are two key influences that the drinks industry has on the environment. Packaging is obviously one of the most influential from a carbon footprint perspective, but we also have to think about biodiversity and ecosystem services and the health of the soil, not to mention the carbon mitigation that we can get through soil health.
What can you tell us about the targets that have been set for achieving net zero emissions within the industry?
I think the drink industry is like every other industry, and it's being led by political targets and by political requirements, legislation, government. Obviously, within Europe, you have CSRD. I think, though, that a lot of the larger businesses are fulfilling those requirements by having net zero targets of between 2030 and 2050. But actually, the drinks industry as a whole is still trying to understand exactly how that footprint works holistically across the supply chain. So a lot of the larger businesses are the ones that are having to really lead by example.
And are some sectors within the industry doing a better job at reducing their footprint than others?
Absolutely. I think the glass industry is particularly cognizant of its impact, and so the majority of drinks are still packaged in glass. So I think that the drinks industry, whether it be Encirc in the UK or Verallia in France, we're seeing them do a huge amount of work in terms of the decarbonisation of glass and the production methods, whether that be through the choice of fuel, electricity or hydrogen, and then indeed the impact of the transport of that packaging. But lightweighting is a great example.
If we look at the importance of packaging in particular, what is the most sustainable kind of packaging for drinks?
The answer to that, of course, is the same as the answer to every good question, which is that it depends. It depends, first of all, on the type of drink, and it depends on how that drink is consumed and how it's transported. Of course, transporting a wine, for example, in bulk and then bottling it in the country of consumption, that reduces emissions hugely compared to shipping a lot of effectively empty glass around the world. I think in terms of carbon emissions, there are really much greater solutions such as PET or indeed the aluminium can. Those are great from a carbon reduction perspective, but of course they come with other knock-on effects. And that could be the mining of aluminium, or it could be in terms of actually a product may be recyclable, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is recycled. We're seeing lots of great research at the moment in the UK and globally from organisations such as the Porter Protocol and Sustainable Wine Roundtable, who are looking at a full life cycle analysis of different types of packaging to be able to help producers make the most sustainable choice for their business.
And what about on a production side? How important is the kind of raw materials that are used and where they come from?
Oh, the raw materials are absolutely vital. I also do some work with the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation. And from a wine perspective, we see such a hugely positive impact on the planet through regenerating soils, healthy soils, living soils, whether that be through soil organic carbon, also through the biomass. So biomass is what we have above ground or below ground that can actually sequester carbon and can really help to mitigate the impacts of the rest of the supply chain. But biodiversity is so important, creating a wonderful, healthy ecosystem, whether that be for microorganisms, for birds, for butterflies, actually creating a really positive impact on the planet within that particular environment. But that's, of course, just for wine. We also have have to remember, and I think sometimes we get disconnected from the farming element of drink, but actually other drinks come from barley or from fruit. And actually those raw materials are absolutely vital to the whole carbon impact of the drink in total.
And of course, we can't talk about raw materials in the drinks industry without talking about water, an essential ingredient, but one that's also really under threat because of climate change and pollution. How is the drinks industry dealing with the potential for water shortages, for example?
Actually, the drinks industry, I think, is probably at the forefront of the impact of climate change in this sense, because it is so dependent upon water. What we're seeing is a huge difference between some regions that are potentially affected, so the Roussillon, for example, where we're seeing extended droughts, and then further north, perhaps in Champagne or the Loire, where we're seeing increasingly unpredictable water events, so really heavy storms, potentially aligned with warmer temperatures that are creating disease pressure. So the wine industry, I think, is really aware of the impact of water and water availability. And we're seeing people mitigating this in lots of different ways, because we understand that irrigation is not necessarily the answer. So we're seeing people looking at having healthy living root systems that enable water retention in the vineyard. And then within the spirits industry, we're seeing people becoming ever more efficient through improvements in technology and innovation, as well as the use and reuse of water, whether that be through filtering systems, whether that be natural filtering systems or new technology, as well as recapturing water that has previously been used, so that's called grey water, and using it for other purposes in the distillery.
And stay with us for a moment. We're going to cross to the German beer-making region of Bavaria, where an effort is underway to reduce waste that is linked to hops. 80% of that plant is usually discarded in the brewing process, but it could be reused in other industries. Olivia Salazar-Winspear tells us more.
Unassuming little cone-like flowers, they're the magical ingredient in your pint glass. Hops have been harvested here in southern Germany for more than 1,000 years. But alongside the liquid gold they produce, there's also a lot of waste. Every kilo used to brew beer generates 3.5 kilos of waste. One startup is putting the leftover leaves, spines and vines to good use, transforming them into sustainable construction materials.
After we cleaned it, we store it, we bring it to our facilities, and then we chop it. And then depending on whether we would produce a product out of the chives only, so one part of the biomass or of the fibers, we then separate that and process with a chemical process to turn it into actual building boards or acoustic panels or thermal insulation.
Hop farming residue is occasionally used for fertilizer or to make biogas, but it's largely difficult to dispose of and can even create further greenhouse gases if left to ferment. Now scientists are trying to tackle the issue at the source by engineering new varieties of the plant.
The new varieties, so we have a low input, high output strategy, produces just 1 kilogram of cones and 1.2 to 1.4 kilogram of waste.
Improved crop efficiency, but taste and quality are also top of the researchers' agenda as they develop a more environmentally friendly way to toast to our good health in typically Bavarian style.
And Joan,